A war just moved closer. He ran on stopping them. After promising to keep Americans out of foreign conflicts and focus on lowering cost for families, Donald Trump has now launched what Senator Mark Kelly calls a large-scale military operation against Iran. That's not spin. That's the description from a former combat pilot and astronaut who flew missions over the Middle East. The shift is real. Airstrikes have targeted Iranian nuclear sites. There has been no war powers vote, no congressional authorization. Jason Crow, an Army Ranger who says he went to war 3 times, calls this a war of choice with no clear endgame, no authorization from Congress, and little support from Americans. Stop there. Military force first. Vote later, if at all. Crow adds something heavier. When elites in Washington bang the war drums, working class folks pay the price. Not the decision makers, not the donors. Working class families. The ones who pick up the guns, jump into the planes and helicopters, and get it done, as he said on television, visibly furious. Now the pattern becomes visible. The president was expected to address the country. Instead, according to Senator Ruben Gallego, he canceled and went to a MAGA Inc. fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago before explaining what the hell is going on. That's the sequence being alleged by sitting senators. Bombs. No defined end goal. No immediate vote. Fundraiser. Look at the gap between words and actions. Mark Kelly says, the question is never whether they can do the mission. It's whether the mission makes sense and makes us safer, and what is it going to cost? That's the fracture line. Not capability, purpose. And once force is used without a clearly stated objective, momentum begins to replace strategy. And momentum is hard to contain. This is not an isolated decision. It fits a pattern. Mark Kelly warned, we've seen this playbook before. Weeks of inflated claims, selective facts, and talk of imminent threats that led the American people into a war that cost thousands of American lives and trillions of taxpayer dollars. That's not abstract history. That's a senator explicitly comparing this moment to the path into Iraq. Now watch the structure. A threat is framed as urgent. Intelligence is cited. A preemptive strike is justified as necessary to avoid higher casualties. A senior Trump administration official claimed U.S. intelligence showed Iran might use missiles preemptively, but if not simultaneous to any American action, and that waiting to be hit would result in substantially higher casualties. Pause there. If the strike was described as simultaneous to U.S. action, then it is reactive by definition. As Senator Gallego put it, they were going to potentially shoot simultaneous, as in shoot if we shot at them, like any other rational country would. That's not rhetoric. That's a direct, logical challenge to the justification. This is where control starts slipping. Because once the word preemptive enters the narrative, the threshold lowers. Acting first becomes the safer option, and safer becomes faster. Gallego, a veteran, says, our young men and women are in danger. Our national security is at risk. He argues the Senate cannot and should not do any votes at all until we vote on a war powers resolution, calling the war wrong, illegal, and not in our interest. Now ask the destabilizing question. If this is truly about imminent defense, why hasn't the full case been laid out publicly before the strike? Why hasn't Congress voted before escalation? Kelly recalls launching on his first combat mission during Operation Desert Storm 35 years ago. I understood the mission and the end goal. So did Congress. So did the American people. That, he says, is the minimum level of leadership this country deserves. The implication is heavier than the accusation. Because if clarity used to be the baseline, and now it isn't, something fundamental has shifted. And shifts like that rarely stay contained. Here's the blunt claim. This isn't just about Iran. It's about accountability collapsing under momentum. Jason Crow didn't hedge his words. I'm just damn furious, he said on television. The man's a 5-time draft dodger. He's an elite. Then he sharpened it. I went to war. I fought with working-class kids. They're the ones that do the fighting and dying. That's not partisan tone. That's a veteran describing who absorbs the cost. Now anchor it. Crow points directly at Trump's own words about casualties, that often happens in war, and it's a cost he's willing to take. Crow's response was cold. Great for him. It's not his kids. It's not his family. It's not his billionaire donors who are having to go off and do it. Notice what's absent. There is no defined end state being publicly articulated in these exchanges. No timeline. No measurable objective. Just willingness to absorb casualties in pursuit of safety. This is where the contradiction widens. Lindsey Graham said if troops die in this operation, they will have died a double death because they sacrificed themselves to make the country safer, calling it a noble mission. The language is elevated. The outcome is lethal. And here's the tension point. Crow says kids are sitting there at military bases in Bahrain, sitting in bunkers right now because Donald Trump is willing to take a chance with their lives. That's a concrete image. Bunkers. Waiting. Not theory. Look at the gap between rhetoric and proximity. One side speaks about nobility. The other speaks about names and faces and who goes first. When the justification becomes emotional elevation, noble death, future safety, but the operational objective remains undefined, the risk isn't just military, it's structural. Because once sacrifice is framed as inevitable, escalation becomes easier to sell. And that's when patterns start repeating. Something subtle is happening. What once triggered national debate now moves faster than discussion. After Vietnam, Congress passed the War Powers Act so that before a president sends troops into harm's way, he has to make the case to the American people, as Congressman Pat Ryan explained. That law exists because of past overreach. It was designed to slow momentum, to force clarity before blood. Now look at this moment. Ryan, who says he served 2 combat tours in Iraq, warns, "We cannot repeat our approach from 2001 and 2002. The answer cannot be we'll figure it out as we go. I lost too many friends because of that logic." That's not theory. That's someone connecting this escalation to names he no longer sees. This is where abnormal becomes routine. Airstrikes are described as necessary. Casualties are acknowledged as part of war. A vote is requested after action begins. And the debate is framed as procedural, as if authorization is a technicality. Ryan sharpened it further. Airstrikes may start a war, but they rarely end it. That line doesn't predict. It warns. Now, the normalization shift is visible. Military action without immediate congressional authorization becomes survivable politically. The language of inevitability softens the shock. That often happens in war. It is a noble mission. These phrases reduce resistance. But here's the pivot. When escalation becomes administratively manageable, when the process itself absorbs the shock, the threshold for the next action lowers. And when the threshold lowers, repetition becomes easier than restraint. That's how policy drifts. Not in dramatic declarations, in quiet adjustments to what feels acceptable. Now the contradiction tightens. On one side, the justification is urgency. Intelligence suggested Iran might strike. Waiting could mean substantially higher casualties, according to a senior Trump administration official describing the analysis. Acting first was framed as the safer path. On the other side, veterans are asking a simpler question. Safer for whom? Senator Ruben Gallego says, "So what's next? All these Iran war boosters are fine with an air war. What happens when it doesn't end neatly? Is Trump willing to commit ground troops?" That isn't speculation about today. It's a question about tomorrow. Notice the gap. Air power is presented as controlled, surgical, limited. But Gallego references Iraq directly. After Saddam was toppled, insurgents were still shooting RPGs at me years later. Regime change did not end resistance. It prolonged it. This is the reframing line. Airstrikes may feel decisive. They are often the beginning. And here's where the tension escalates further. Gallego argues Americans should not be put in danger for the interest of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Israel, calling the war wrong, illegal, and not in our interest. That's not just opposition. That's a claim that the underlying strategic alignment may not match domestic security priorities. Meanwhile, Lindsey Graham says if troops die, they will have died a noble death. Elevated language, moral framing, acceptance of loss before it occurs. Look at that collision. One side demanding a vote before escalation expands. The other framing potential death as honorable necessity. When sacrifice is normalized before strategy is defined, the public is asked to accept cost before being shown the blueprint, and that permanently shifts the baseline of consent. Now the pressure starts stacking. First, airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Second, Iranian Revolutionary Guard rhetoric promising they will unleash attacks like they've never done before in history and will target the United States all over the globe, as referenced in the discussion. Third, American troops sitting in bunkers at bases in Bahrain, according to Jason Crow's description, because the decision has already been made. That's escalation in 3 movements: strike, retaliation threat, troops exposed. And this is where momentum accelerates. A senior administration official argues that waiting would have meant absorbing a missile barrage with substantially higher casualties. Acting first was framed as damage control. But if Iran responds, and they publicly signal they will, then the preemptive logic resets. Another response becomes necessary. Watch the loop forming. Action justified to prevent casualties. Retaliation threatens casualties. Counteraction justified to prevent greater casualties. Now the tempo increases. Senator Mark Kelly says, the question is never whether they can do the mission. It's whether the mission makes sense. Capability is not the constraint. Judgment is. And judgment under momentum becomes compressed. Congress has not yet voted. Senators are demanding immediate return to Washington. Heck yeah, I do, Jason Crow said when asked if there should be a vote. I'm willing to jump on a plane in an hour. But planes are already in the air. Troops are already deployed. Threats are already public. This is no longer about a single decision. It's about a chain reaction. And once a chain reaction begins, slowing it requires political force equal to military force. What happens if this doesn't slow down? Now bring this closer. Not to Washington, to you. Jason Crow said it directly. When elites in Washington bang the war drums, working class folks pay the price. That isn't metaphor, it's math. The people who make the decision are rarely the ones who deploy. He described kids in towns across the country who pick up the guns, jump into the planes and helicopters, and get it done. He talked about service members sitting in bunkers in Bahrain right now, waiting. That's not abstract geopolitics. That's someone's son, someone's daughter, someone refreshing their phone at 2 a.m. Now look at the economic layer. Crow pointed out that endless war has cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, while Americans are struggling to pay for healthcare, groceries, and housing. The same speech that promised lower costs now coexists with open-ended military engagement. This is where the personal collision happens. If escalation continues, it isn't just troop rotations. It's defense spending shifts. It's supply chain shocks. It's oil markets reacting. It's budget priorities moving. It's the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility of ground troops if air war doesn't end neatly, as Gallego warned. And you don't have to pick a side to feel that weight. You just have to live here. Pat Ryan said, "You deserve to know who wants to send your kids to war to fight for Trump's lies. Strip the rhetoric away, and one core demand remains: clarity before sacrifice." If this feels close to home, say that in the comments. Because the distance between foreign policy and personal life is often shorter than it appears. And when that distance collapses, the consequences are not theoretical. Step back from the headlines. There's a mechanism underneath this. The Constitution places the power to declare war with Congress. After Vietnam, lawmakers passed the War Powers Act specifically to prevent unilateral escalation. Pat Ryan referenced that directly. Before a president sends troops into harm's way, he has to make the case to the American people. That's the structural break. But breaks only work if they're applied. Right now, according to multiple senators speaking publicly, military action has already begun while Congress is being urged to return to Washington immediately to vote. Jason Crow said he's willing to jump on a plane in an hour to take that vote. That tells you something. The decision is already operational, and the constitutional mechanism is trying to catch up. Now the systemic insight. Modern military capability allows rapid, precise strikes. Decisions can be executed in hours. Political deliberation moves slower. When speed becomes the default, the constitutional process risks becoming reactive instead of preventative. That's not ideology, that's sequencing. Airstrikes first, authorization debate second. Mark Kelly said that during Operation Desert Storm, Congress and the American people understood the mission and the end goal before launch. That's the comparison point being raised by a former combat pilot. The unsettling reality is this. In a system built for deliberation, speed can quietly outpace oversight. And when oversight trails behind force, the center of gravity shifts toward the executive by default. That shift doesn't announce itself, it just happens. Now look forward, not emotionally, structurally. There are at least two plausible paths from here. Path 1, contained escalation. Airstrikes remain limited. Iran calibrates its response. Rhetoric is fierce, but retaliation is measured. Congress votes after the fact, perhaps dividing sharply, but the operation stabilizes into a defined posture. That is the controlled scenario. Path 2, the loop continues. Iran follows through on threats to strike U.S. targets all over the globe. Even a single successful attack shifts public pressure. Retaliation follows, then counter-retaliation. The logic of preventing higher casualties resets again, each move framed as necessary. This is where velocity matters. Gallego asked, what happens when it doesn't end neatly? Is Trump willing to commit ground troops? That question doesn't assume invasion. It highlights the slope. Air war becomes insufficient. Advisors argue credibility is on the line. Casualties demand response. Notice something else. Language is already preparing the ground. Noble mission. They will have died a double death. That often happens in war. These phrases normalize loss before it occurs. They shape expectations, and expectations influence tolerance. If casualties happen, are they seen as strategic failure or expected sacrifice? That framing affects how far escalation can go. Mark Kelly warned this is a playbook the country has seen before. Selective facts, imminent threat language, urgency. He didn't say it will repeat identically. He implied the trajectory feels familiar. The next move may already be forming, not in speeches, in calculations. And once those calculations harden, reversing course becomes politically harder than pressing forward. Here's the line that reframes everything. The question is not whether America can win. It's whether anyone defined what winning is before the first strike. Mark Kelly said, the question is never whether they can do the mission. It's whether the mission makes sense. That's the core tension. Capability has never been in doubt. Purpose is. Jason Crow wants names on a vote. They deserve accountability, he said. They deserve to know who is willing to take chances with their national security, their kids' lives, their taxpayer dollars. That demand isn't about politics. It's about ownership of consequence. Because once force is deployed, consequence follows someone home. Maybe it stabilizes. Maybe it escalates. Maybe Congress asserts itself. Maybe momentum keeps moving. But the structural shift has already occurred. Action first, authorization debate second. That is the pattern under the event. And patterns matter more than moments. If this remains limited, it will be cited as decisive leadership. If it expands, it will be traced back to this exact sequence: the promise to avoid war, the launch of a large-scale military operation, the absence of an initial vote, the warnings from veterans who have already buried friends. History doesn't begin with catastrophe. It begins with justification. So the real fracture isn't just between parties. It's between speed and oversight, between momentum and consent. And until that fracture is resolved, every new development will carry the same underlying question. Who decided the risk was acceptable? If you want analysis that dissects the structure beneath the headlines, not just the headlines themselves, subscribe. Because this story isn't finished. It's accelerating.